Enoch Powell's April 20, 1968 address to the General Meeting of the West Midlands Area Conservative Political Centre was a speech criticising Commonwealth immigration and anti-discrimination legislation that had been proposed in the United Kingdom. Powell was the Conservative Member of Parliament for Wolverhampton South West. Though Powell referred to the speech as the Birmingham speech, it is otherwise known as the Rivers of Blood speech, a title derived from its allusion to a line from Virgil's Aeneid. Although the phrase Rivers of Blood does not appear in the speech, the name alludes to the line, "As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the River Tiber foaming with much blood." The speech caused a political storm, making Powell one of the most talked about politicians in the country, and leading to his controversial dismissal from the shadow cabinet by Conservative Party leader Edward Heath. According to most accounts, the popularity of Powell's perspective on race may have played a decisive contributory factor in the Conservative surprise victory in the 1970 general election, and he became one of the most persistent rebels opposing the subsequent Heath government. Background: Powell made the speech on April 20, 1968 in Birmingham, to a meeting of the Conservative Political Centre. The Labour government's Race Relations Bill 1968 was to have its second reading the following Tuesday, and the Conservative opposition had tabled an amendment significantly weakening its provisions. The bill was a successor to the Race Relations Act 1965. The Birmingham-based television company ATV saw an advance copy of the speech on the Saturday morning, and its news editor ordered a television crew to go to the venue, where they filmed sections of the speech. Earlier in the week, Powell said to his friend Clement Jones, who was a journalist at the Wolverhampton Express and Star, "I'm going to make a speech at the weekend and it's going to go up fizz like a rocket. But whereas all rockets fall to the earth, this one is going to stay up." The speech, Powell recounted a conversation with one of his constituents, a middle-aged working man, a few weeks earlier. Powell said that the man told him, "If I had the money to go, I wouldn't stay in this county. I have 3 children, all of them been through grammar school and 2 of them married now, with family. I shan't be satisfied till I have seen them all settled overseas." The man finished by saying to Powell, "In this country in 15 or 20 years' time the black man will have the whip hand over the white man." Powell went on, "Here is a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman, who in broad daylight in my own town says to me, his Member of Parliament, that the country will not be worth living in for his children. I simply do not have the right to shrug my shoulders and think about something else. What he is saying, thousands and hundreds of thousands are saying and thinking not throughout Great Britain, perhaps, but in the areas that are already undergoing the total transformation to which there is no parallel in 1,000 years of English history." Powell went on to say, "We must be mad, literally mad, as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents, who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre. So insane are we that we actually permit unmarried persons to immigrate for the purpose of founding a family with spouses and fiancé copywriters whom they have never seen." Powell quoted a letter he received from a woman in Northumberland, about an elderly woman living in a Wolverhampton street where she was the only white resident. The elderly woman had lost her husband and her 2 sons in World War II and had rented out the rooms in her house. Once immigrants had moved into the street she was living in, her white lodgers left. 2 black men had knocked on her door at 7 a.m. to use her telephone to call their employers, but she refused, as she would have done to any other stranger knocking at her door at such an hour, and was subsequently verbally abused. She had asked her local authority for a rates reduction, but was told by a council officer to let out the rooms of her house. When the woman said the only tenants would be black, the council officer replied, "Racial prejudice won't get you anywhere in this country." He advocated voluntary re-emigration by generous grants and assistance, and he claimed that immigrants had asked him whether it was possible. Powell said that all citizens should be equal before the law, and that This does not mean that the immigrant and his descendants should be elevated into a privileged or special class, or that the citizen should be denied his right to discriminate in the management of his own affairs between one fellow citizen and another, or that he should be subjected to an inquisition as to his reasons and motives for behaving in one lawful manner rather than another. He argued that journalists who urged the government to pass anti-discrimination laws were of the same kidney and sometimes on the same newspapers which year after year in the 1930s tried to blind this country to the rising peril which confronted it. Powell said that such legislation would be used to discriminate against the indigenous population and that it would be like throwing a match onto gunpowder. Powell described what he thought the position of the indigenous population would be. For reasons which they could not comprehend, and in pursuance of a decision by default, on which they were never consulted, they found themselves made strangers in their own country. They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighborhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work they found that employers hesitated to apply to the immigrant worker the standards of discipline and competence required of a native-born worker. They began to hear, as time went by, more and more voices which told them that they were now the unwanted. On top of this, they now learn that a one-way privilege is to be established by Act of Parliament. A law which cannot, and is not intended to, operate to protect them or redress their grievances, is to be enacted to give the stranger, the disgruntled and the agent provocateur the power to pillory them for their private actions. Powell argued that although many thousands of immigrants want to integrate, he contended that the majority did not, and that some had vested interests in fostering racial and religious differences with a view to the exercise of actual domination, first over fellow immigrants and then over the rest of the population. Powell's peroration of the speech gave rise to its popular title. He quotes the Sibyl's prophecy in the epic poem Aeneid, 6:86–87, of wars, terrible wars, and the Tiber foaming with much blood. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the River Tiber foaming with much blood. That tragic and intractable phenomenon which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic but which there is interwoven with the history and existence of the states itself, is coming upon us here by our own volition and our own neglect. Indeed, it has all but come. In numerical terms, it will be of American proportions long before the end of the century. Only resolute and urgent action will avert it even now. Whether there will be the public will to demand and obtain that action, I do not know. All I know is that to see, and not to speak, would be the great betrayal. Reaction. According to C. Howard Weldon, who was present at the meeting in which Powell gave the speech, it is fascinating to note what little hostility emerged from the audience. To the best of my memory, only one person voiced any sign of annoyance. The day after the speech Powell went to Sunday communion at his local church, and when he emerged there was a crowd of journalists and a local plasterer said to Powell, "Well done, sir." It needed to be said. Powell asked the assembled journalists, "Have I really caused such a furore?" At midday Powell went on the BBC's World This Weekend to defend his speech, and he appeared later that day on ITN News. The Labour MP Edward Heath said he would refer the speech to the Director of Public Prosecutions. The Liberal Party leader Jeremy Thorpe spoke of a prima facie case against Powell for incitement. Lady Gaitskell called the speech cowardly, and the cricketer Sir Leary Constantine condemned it. The leading Conservatives in the shadow cabinet were outraged by the speech. Ian MacLeod, Edward Boyle, Quintin Hogg and Robert Carr all threatened to resign from the front bench unless Powell was sacked. Margaret Thatcher thought that some of Powell's speech was strong meat, and said to Heath when he telephoned her to inform her Powell was to be sacked, "I really thought that it was better to let things cool down for the present rather than heighten the crisis." The Conservative leader, Edward Heath, sacked Powell from his post as Shadow Defence Secretary, telling him on the telephone that Sunday evening. Heath said of the speech in public that it was racialist in tone and liable to exacerbate racial tensions. Conservative MPs on the right of the party Duncan Sands, Gerald Nabarro, Teddy Tylora spoke against Powell's sacking. On April 22, 1968, Heath went on Panorama, telling Robin Day, I dismissed Mr. Powell because I believed his speech was inflammatory and liable to damage race relations. I am determined to do everything I can to prevent racial problems developing into civil strife. I don't believe the great majority of the British people share Mr. Powell's way of putting his views in his speech. The Times newspaper declared it an evil speech, stating this is the first time that a serious British politician has appealed to racial hatred in this direct way in our post-war history. The Times went on to record incidents of racial attacks in the immediate aftermath of Powell's speech. One such incident, reported under the headline "Coloured Family Attacked," took place on April 30, 1968 in Wolverhampton itself. It involved a slashing incident with 14 white youths chanting Powell, and, "Why didn't you go back to your own country?" at patrons of a West Indian christening party. One of the West Indian victims, Wade Crooks of Lower Villiers Street, was the child's grandfather. He had to have 8 stitches over his left eye. He was reported as saying, "I have been here since 1955 and nothing like this has happened before. I am shattered." An opinion poll commissioned by the BBC television programme Panorama in December 1968 found that 8% of immigrants believed that they had been treated worse by white people since Powell's speech, 38% would like to return to their country of origin if offered financial help, and 47% supported immigration control, with 30% opposed. On April 23, 1968, the Race Relations Bill had its second reading in the House of Commons. Many MPs referred or alluded to Powell's speech. For Labour, Paul Rose, Maurice Orbach, Reginald Paget, Dingle Foot, Ivor Richard, and David Ennals were all critical. Among the Conservatives, Quintin Hogg and Nigel Fisher were critical, while Hugh Fraser, Ronald Bell, Dudley Smith, and Harold Gurdon were sympathetic. Powell was present for the debate but did not speak. Earlier that day, 1,000 London dockers had gone on strike in protest at Powell's sacking and marched from the East End to the Palace of Westminster carrying placards saying "Don't knock Enoch," and "Back Britain, not Black Britain." 300 of them went into the palace, 100 to lobby the MP for Stepney, Peter Shaw, and 200 to lobby the MP for Poplar, Ian Mikado. Shaw and Mikado were shouted down and some dockers kicked Mikado. Lady Gaitskell shouted, "You will have your remedy at the next election." The dockers replied, "We won't forget." The organizer of the strike, Harry Pearman, headed a delegation to meet Powell and said after, "I have just met Enoch Powell and it made me feel proud to be an Englishman. He told me that he felt that if this matter was swept under the rug he would lift the rug and do the same again. We are representatives of the working man. We are not racialists." On April 24, 600 dockers at St Catherine's Docks voted to strike and numerous smaller factories across the country followed. 600 Smithfield meat porters struck and marched to Westminster and handed Powell a 92-page petition supporting him. Powell advised against strike action and asked them to write to Harold Wilson, Heath or their MP. However, strikes continued, reaching Tilbury by April 25 and he allegedly received his 30,000th letter supporting him, with 30 protesting against his speech. By April 27, 4,500 dockers were on strike. On April 28, 1,500 people marched to Downing Street chanting "Arrest Enoch Powell." Powell claimed to have received 43,000 letters and 700 telegrams supporting him by early May, with 800 letters and 4 telegrams against. On May 2, the Attorney General, Sir Elwyn Jones, announced he would not prosecute Powell after consulting the Director of Public Prosecutions. Whilst a section of the white population appeared to warm to Powell over the speech, the author Mike Phillips recalls that it legitimized hostility, and even violence, towards Black Britons like himself. The Gallup organization took an opinion poll at the end of April and found that 74% agreed with what Powell had said in his speech. 15% disagreed. 69% felt Heath was wrong to sack Powell and 20% believed Heath was right. Before his speech Powell was favoured to replace Heath as Conservative leader by 1%, with Reginald Maudling favoured by 20%. After his speech 24% favoured Powell and 18% Maudling. 83% now felt immigration should be restricted and 65% favored anti-discrimination legislation. Powell defended his speech on May 4 through an interview for the Birmingham Post. "What I would take racialist to mean is a person who believes in the inherent inferiority of one race of mankind to another, and who acts and speaks in that belief. So the answer to the question of whether I am a racialist is no, unless, perhaps, it is to be a racialist in reverse. I regard many of the peoples in India as being superior in many respects intellectually, for example, and in other respects to Europeans. Perhaps it is overcorrecting." Powell was mentioned in early versions of the song Get Back by the Beatles. In November 2010, the actor and comedian Snehav Bhaskar recalled the fear which the speech instilled in Britons of Indian origin. "At the end of the 1960s, Enoch Powell was quite a frightening figure to us. He was the one person who represented an enforced ticket out, so we always had suitcases that were ready and packed. My parents held the notion that we may have to leave." In his book The British Dream, David Goodhart claims that Powell's speech in effect put back by more than a generation a robust debate about the successes and failures of immigration. Identity of the woman mentioned in the speech. After Powell delivered the speech, there were attempts to locate the Wolverhampton constituent whom Powell described as being victimized by non-white residents. Despite combing the electoral register and other sources, the editor of the local Wolverhampton newspaper The Express and Star, Clem Jones, failed to identify the woman. Shortly after Powell's death, Kenneth Knock, a Wolverhampton solicitor, wrote to The Express and Star in April 1998 to claim that his firm had acted for the woman in question, but that he could not name her owing to rules concerning client confidentiality. In January 2007, the BBC Radio 4 programme Document, followed by the Daily Mail, claimed to have uncovered the woman's identity. They said she was Drusilla Cotterill, the widow of Harry Cotterill, a battery quartermaster sergeant with the Royal Artillery who had been killed in World War II. She lived in Brighton Place in Wolverhampton, which by the 1960s was dominated by immigrant families. In order to increase her income, she rented rooms to lodgers, but did not wish to rent rooms to West Indians and stopped taking in any lodgers when the Race Relations Act 1968 banned racial discrimination in housing. She locked up the spare rooms and lived only in 2 rooms of the house. According to those who remember the period, the many children in the street regarded her as a figure of fun and taunted her. Support for the speech. In the United Kingdom, particularly in England, Enoch Powell was right as a phrase of political rhetoric, inviting comparison of aspects of contemporary English society with the predictions made by Powell in the Rivers of Blood speech. The phrase implies criticism of racial quotas, immigration and multiculturalism. Badges, T-shirts and other items bearing the slogan have been produced at different times in the United Kingdom. Powell gained support from both right-wing and traditionally left-leaning, working-class voters for his anti-immigration stance. In November 2007, Nigel Hastelot resigned as Conservative candidate for Halesowen and Rowley Regis after he wrote an article in the Wolverhampton Express and Star that included the statement, "Enoch, once MP for Wolverhampton South West, was sacked from the Conservative frontbench and marginalised politically for his 1968 Rivers of Blood speech, warning that uncontrolled immigration would change Britain irrevocably." He was right, and immigration has changed the face of Britain dramatically. In January 2014, UK Independence Party leader Nigel Farage stated that the basic principle of one passage of the speech which had been read to him was right. In June of that year, in response to an Islamist plot to infiltrate schools in Birmingham, Conservative peer and former Minister Norman Tebbit wrote in the Daily Telegraph, "No one should have been surprised at what was going on in schools in Birmingham. It is precisely what I was talking about over 20 years ago and Enoch Powell was warning against long before that. We have imported far too many immigrants who have come here not to live in our society, but to replicate here the society of their homelands." Conservative MP Gerald Howarth said on the same issue clearly, "The arrival of so many people of non-Christian faith has presented a challenge, as so many of us, including the late Enoch Powell, warned decades ago." Acknowledgement from politicians. the Labour Party MP Michael Foot remarked to a reporter that it was tragic that this outstanding personality had been widely misunderstood as predicting actual bloodshed in Britain, when in fact he had used the Aeneid quotation merely to communicate his own sense of foreboding. 30 years after the speech, Edward Heath said that Powell's remarks on the economic burden of immigration had been not without prescience. In an interview for Today shortly after her departure from office in 1991, Margaret Thatcher said that Powell had made a valid argument, if in sometimes regrettable terms. See also: Criticism of multiculturalism, Demographics of the United Kingdom, Protests of 1968. References. Bibliography: Goodhart, David. The British Dream, Successes and Failures of Post-War Immigration. London, Atlantic Books. ISBN 9781843548058. Heffer, Simon. Like the Roman, The Life of Enoch Powell. London, Orion. ISBN 0-7538-0820-X. McLean, Ian. Rational Choice in British Politics. Oxford, Oxfordshire, Oxford University Press. ISBN 0-19-829529-4. Powell, Enoch. Freedom and Reality. Kingwood, Elliot Rightway Books. ISBN 0-7160-0541-7. Raff, Andrew. Enoch Powell, Tory Tribune. London, MacDonald and Company. ISBN 0-356-03150-0. External links: Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, The Daily Telegraph, November 6, 2007. Full text of the speech, document The Woman Who Never Was. BBC Radio 4, January 22, 2007. Fiona Barton, widow, and Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech really did exist. Mail Online, February 2, 2007, radio interview on immigration. Powell interviewed shortly after his controversial Rivers of Blood speech, BBC News, speech that has raised a storm press reaction from the Birmingham Post, April 22, 1968, Rivers of Blood, The Real Source. BBC Radio 4, March 3, 2008.